First of all, I'm going to give you some basic concepts when you're going to make a chatbot. As you know, a chatbot is like any software project in itself. That is to say, you have to set some goals and a scope, and the scope will be related to the intent and what you want that chatbot to reply. The intent is what the user tells the chatbot that it needs. That is to say, the questions that the chatbot that the user asks. In the case of Rudy, it could be a question about the event, and the intent would be know about conferences. Now, there is another concept besides the intents that are the entities, and this is relevant information inside the intent that gives more content or more semantics to the intent. In this model, it would be the type of conference that interests the user. And that entity will have different values. If it's the events track, it will be, for example, business conference, mobile, conference AI, etc. And for each one of these values, the entities have synonyms. For example, in the case of mobile, a possible synonym could be its SD, or for AI, it could be a synonym that is artificial intelligence, for example. And what are these synonyms useful for? For the values, it's to give more freedom when the user is expressing the intent and given more vast knowledge to the provider in LP, which is the processor of natural language, is the branch of artificial intelligence that is in charge of interpreting the user's language. Interpret what the user means. It may be written or spoken language. So this information, the intent, and the entities are contained in the LP provider. Now, how does the provider understand the intent? It's through training. The machine learning is the branch of artificial intelligence that is participating in this. We have to train the LP provider with a set of data of good quality that give examples about the user's intent. That is to say that there are examples to express the intent. For example, I want to know about a talk, about a session, I need information about a track, etc. So these are basically the concepts I wanted to explain before telling you what we have in GeneXus. What we have is the chatbot generator. It is a solution that will allow us to go from the chatbot model, a conceptual model, to a model in GeneXus in such a way that we have in the LP provider the dialogue with its intents and entities. So what we have in GeneXus is an object which is called conversational flows, the one you see on the left, and it's a tree which has flows. The flows are the main nodes of the tree, and each one of the flows is equivalent to an intent and the resolution, the way of solving the intent or the reply to the intent. The important thing to take into account is that based on this model in GeneXus, we will be able to make a synchronization in the LP provider directly and obtain in the provider the dialogue, the intents, and the entities that are modeled in GeneXus. That is to say, we don't have to go to the provider to touch anything. Based on the GeneXus model and the synchronization that is in the synchronization, we can obtain the model in LP. So to tell you a bit about the architecture, I'm sorry, there's some images that we can't see, but I'll tell you anyway about the architecture. So we have the side of the client, which could be web or mobile, and obviously there we are going to have a chatbot. The interesting thing is that we don't have to program the chatbot, because in GeneXus, when we create an object conversational flow, several resources are important. Among them, a chat panel for web and a chat panel for UI, which has solved the use of Messenger API, etc., to send a message. On the side of the services in the server, what we have is a service that is in charge of processing the message that the user has sent and shape it according to the features of the LP provider to sell it to the provider. The provider, the values of the entities are identified as well as the user's intent, and the reply goes back to the server. In the server, there is a handler that is generated based on the model that we have in GeneXus that knows how to send the client the answer. It could be a text reply, or it can be multimedia. That is why the handler is the one that is generated on the basis of the model, and is the one who knows how to resend the reply to the client. On the side of the client, we have chat panels that are part of the resources that we have in GeneXus already made for us. Those resources are in a module that is called Common Chatbot and that you will see in the workshop. On the side of the server, we have certain services that are in a module called Chatbot. This module that is installed in the KB, an external module. We also have certain tables where the information of the messages is kept, the messages table and the users table. We also have a handler which is the one that knows where to redirect the message and how to do it. This handler is contained in a module that is generated based on a model. And on the side of the provider, the generation of the data in the provider is also automatic, whether it's the dialogue, the intent, or the entities. So what do we have in GeneXus? What do we have to do? We have to create an object, conversational flows, which functions as a pattern. So you are going to see a conversational pattern in the KB, which has certain properties that have to be configured, which are generic. I was interested in particular I wanted you to see this one in particular, the keep resources updated, which are the resources that are imported in the KB I was telling you about. They are imported automatically, and there you can configure whether you want these resources to be imported always, never, or to be asked. The recommendation is to import these resources because you can have updates and then make changes. As an object, as I said, we have an object called conversational flow and an instance of conversational flow, as we call it, because it is a pattern and it will be an instance of conversational flow that will map directly with the chatbot. We can have several instances in the KB, and each one will be a pattern. So let's see how an intent is solved, which is what you're going to do in the practical workshop. Let's say that you want information about a speaker. So the first thing is to search in the KB an object concerning the speaker or create it. What I have in the KB is a data provider that receives as a parameter the speaker and sends back certain information, which is the picture, the biography, the name, the company he works for. So what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to go to the object conversational flows, to the instance. I'm going to add a flow because you will remember that a flow is mapped directly as an intent. So I want to add an intent. This intent will be named details from speaker, for example, which is the detail that I want to get. And what I'm going to do firstly is to complete the trigger messages, which are the messages concerning examples or the training messages that I'm going to give the LP provider so that it can identify the intent. Another thing I'm going to do is in the main node, details from speaker, I have a property, conversational objects, where I'm going to put the data provider I told you about that is going to solve the query. Given the speaker, it's going to send back information from the speaker. So since the input parameter of this data provider is the speaker, as a user input of the flow, I will have the speaker. The user input is what is going to be asked, and the reply to the user will be all the information that is returned by the data provider, the photo, the full name, the company, etc. So what I did so far is just a flow, a new flow, where I put the trigger messages so that the LP provider can identify the intent and assigns a conversational object so that, given the speaker, there is information that is sent back. An important detail is that in this model, we chose to make the speaker an entity inside the LP provider because maybe the user does not remember exactly the name of the speaker. Maybe he knows the nickname or an email address or a combination of the name and the email. And in this sense, it's interesting to have inside the LP provider the speaker as an entity so that the value is the full name, but we also have a nickname, an email address, etc., in order to give more flexibility to the user when it is expressing the intent. So the speaker is a user input, and we put the property match with identity. So this user input maps with a speaker inside, or rather maps with an entity inside the LP provider, and the entity is called speaker. This information goes straight to the provider. So what we need now is to show the reply. And how are we going to show it? It could be a text that says the speaker works for such and such company, or can show a graph or a component with the photo, the biography, the full name. How am I going to show a component as a result of this flow? What I do is to define a message, and I have a property that allows me to assign a component, which is the one that is going to show the result, the output of the data provider. The interesting thing is that this component is generated automatically based on the output of the data provider. I can change it if I want, but I have one that is generated automatically. And what this component does basically is in the client start to call my data provider and to show the results on the screen. If I don't like it or I want to change it, I can obviously do it and assign mine to that property. And with this, I have solved this flow. I can do a generate chatbot, and in that case, it generates all of the objects that are necessary. For example, in this case, the component I told you about, the handler is updated. All of these objects that are generated on the basis of my model are obtained in this option, generate chatbot. Then I do a build and I get the results. An important detail we have to take into account when we build a chatbot, we need the context. We always need to establish the context because we can't use a number of times the same thing to a user. If we are talking about Gaston Milano and then the user says, and when is going to have a session, when is going to speak, it wouldn't be correct that the chatbot asks the user, which speaker do you mean? The speaker has to be inside the context. And this is what we are referring to with this. What we have in GeneXus is that each user input, all of the user inputs by default are inside the context unless the opposite is declared. Unless I say this user input in particular I want to clean and I don't want it inside the context. Therefore, I'm going to ask for it again. And this is a property clean context value. If I tell GeneXus this user input should be cleaned before entering into this flow, then I am going to be able to ask once again the user for this input. In detail from speaker, I want the context to be clean because maybe I want to ask today about Gaston and tomorrow about Diego. But in some other cases, I don't want to clean the context. I want to continue answering about the same person. I want to show you another intent which I find important. All this has a lot of power and there are many things we can do. And I can't show you everything, but I'm going to show you about redirections. Sometimes it's necessary to redirect something because not everything can be solved in a flow. If the question is too vast and the answer cannot be given, maybe we can ask for more specific information, reply with another question so that the user is more specific, and redirect the flow so that the question is solved and the response is given. So if the user asks for information and doesn't say about what, just says, I need information, then we can ask what kind of information you need. The user input is services, for example, and I said specifically which services uh, are you interested in? And I can say, for example, I can give you information about the secretariat or the agenda of the event. And when the user replies, in order to give a correct answer, we will have three redirections or three possible redirections. In each one, we have a condition. If the user responds that he wants to know about the shop of the event, for example, we redirect it to the flow that gives information about the shop. Or it can be, for example, another aspect, the secretariat or the cloakroom. So we have resolved two flows which are interesting in my opinion. And I also wanted to tell you about validation or managing sessions. Sometimes the user is not clear about what he needs, so we can retry, not to abort the flow, say, I didn't understand, and leave. We can ask whether he can give more specific information and help him in this regard. And so we have a property called ask again to ask the question again and try limit. For example, n times we ask, and if it's not understood, then the flow has to be aborted and he will have to manifest his intent once again. And in each intent, we can give him new tips to help him. I didn't understand this, but I can respond this other thing. And then we have a new property that was released in upgrade 4 or 5, I don't remember, which is a validation in the user input. We can assign a procedure to this property so that in that procedure we can program the validation. And to finish, I will tell you about the APIs which allow us to work on the chatbots. The trigger messages API trains the provider in LP. Sorry, the NLP provider. The developer has finished the work, but there is a training work that is being done by other people who are experts and are training the chatbot. We can have a backend, for example, through which, using the APIs of trigger messages, we can feed the NLP provider sending new training messages. In GeneXus, I'm not doing anything because the work has already been done. The interesting thing is that we want to match both models with regard to the training messages. When we open the GeneXus instances and we connect to the NLP provider, there is a merge between messages. We are always going to match the training messages in the GeneXus model and in the model in the NLP provider. We have an API of identities. For example, we have a new speaker, and we're going to use this API to add the speaker with the synonyms. X person with email, etc. Then we have an API for the context. I spoke about the context a minute ago. This API allows us to set the context for the user and also globally in a programmatic manner and recover the context always at the level of the program. For example, frequent case is that if the user is logged in, we are not going to ask him who he is. When he logs in, maybe I can set in the context the user's information and in a programmatic manner from the chatbot and from the procedures the chatbot uses read the context, and I know already who the user is. And I'm not asking who is the user. And the Messages API is also new and it's interesting. It allows us to automate the test of a chatbot. We do a cross batch that bombards the NLP provider with messages as a test, and the provider is going to analyze the messages as usual. The validation is going to be made from one field to the other, the validation of the user inputs, and the redirections also as if it were executing as use of the UI, but it's not going to be batch. The message will come, and we are going to recover the message and do the verifications we do in a test. And one more thing that you'll see in a minute. We have a try-live in GeneXus. There is a tab in the instance called try-live, which allows us to send messages to the provider to see the answer. Here we are not going to see any graphic component, but at least it is useful to see how the provider replies. Okay, do we have time for questions? In the change of context, I asked the same thing to Rudy. I asked about the speeches by Nicolas Jodal, and I asked who Nicolas Jodal was, and I also asked about Sebastián Gómez, who's right there. And Sebastián says that Rudy understands the hierarchy, so he came back with Nicolas again. So as you say, the clean context does not mean that I know in advance what is going to be asked, because he changed the object of the person. What Rudy did was to reply from the previous context. So maybe Diego can give you an answer. Now we will have to look at the case. He should have replied, giving you Sebastián Gómez presentations. So I would have to look at this case in particular. In fact, the flow you did was to ask about Jodal and his talks, and then ask about Gomez, and you didn't get Gomez information. No, he got Mr. Jodal's presentations. Well, we would have to see the context, because the flow that shows you the speech from one speaker has this property of clearing the context. If there's something in the context, it takes them, but it should have recognized that there was a name of a speaker that had been assigned already. Well, my question is whether it is automatic or I have to program it. It's automatic. If you define the property, the behavior should be that it overrides it. I wanted to clarify that with WhatsApp in particular, we had some issues with the provider. It was changing the order of the messages sometimes. We were sending them in a certain way, and if there were many, it got confused and sent a reply that corresponded to a previous question. I don't know whether this was the case for you, whether it was on WhatsApp or in the application. It was in WhatsApp, so maybe that's the case. That's what happened. Yes, the order was not correct. The previous question had been answered correctly, but when I tried to change the context without saying that I was changing the context, that was the issue. That's the issue. I'd like to ask something else. We have time for questions. I'm thinking of more questions. I saw other videos of yours where you talk about training documents, etc. When I saw these ones, I was a bit confused. Did the way in which you do things with chatbot change, or are there other mechanisms where you have to take documents, train the NLP, and the NLP will answer? Is it a different environment? Yes, last year we spoke with Luciano Silveira. We had a presentation on a solution that was a support assistant. One of the legs was the chatbot. It was in WhatsApp. And the other part was precisely the processing of certain documents. It was a support assistant. With the chatbot, we solved the questions, we interpreted the user's intent, we knew what he needed, and on the other side, what we did was another service, which is Discovery, has nothing to do with chatbot. It's not the Watson assistant, it's the Discovery, where we had the documents in order to search for the information that the user was asking for. It has nothing to do with this, in fact. Well, was in a presentation on chatbots, and you're talking about this. So mentally, I'm wondering, do I need to do this beforehand, send the information before I start with a chatbot that the NLP understands it? Yes, but it has nothing to do with the documents, which is another matter. It was a solution in this case to take care of the support answers, but the reply was in the documents. That's why we uploaded the documents to Discovery, which is another service, and we had the documents. But this doesn't have the documents. What we have now is training, but of the intent messages of the users specifically. Everything goes through trigger messages. Yes, exactly. The solution is smaller. In that case, there were two legs. Well, don't say was. I would like artificial intelligence now. Yes, this year we couldn't do a lot in this regard, but what I mean is that's another solution where one part was with chatbot, and the training of the chatbot specifically was the messages in order to understand the user's intent. And that can be done with the API trigger messages. All of your videos on chatbots show this, and you don't understand very well why on the one hand you have to train it with documents and the other hand the messages. Is it that now we don't need to do what we did before? No, they're different things. This is a trigger message, because in the other one you have to train so that they know which are the GeneXus objects, etc., and the context. Yes, but that's completely different. We're using the wiki and the wiki documents and putting them in the IBM cloud and training them. Yes, but this is part of what the users are looking for. I think that this will have repercussions on us who make applications, because when you make one and then another people, we want everything there. Yes, a comprehensive solution. Yes, it's going to grow from every side. It means that if I do it from another site, I also have to subscribe to the other discovery service. Yes, it's another service. IBM has many. The discovery allows you to search for information inside documents. You upload the documents to the cloud, IBM's cloud, and there it does a search with artificial intelligence. It's not a common search. And in the case of synonyms, if I have many, you have a very small area where you write. Can you load them in a programmatic manner or incremental? Well, we have the API identities. The API entities allows you to send entities to the NLP provider. For example, floor. You define the entity, you put the value. And the synonyms, for example, ground floor, all of the synonyms. And this we would have to send to Rudy because I asked about the floor and he replied with this nonsense. And here you have the method that allows you to send the value and the synonyms to the NLP provider. You send the instance, which will be Rudy, the SDT that I just loaded with the values and the synonyms, the entity that is floors, and an outgoing message for the feedback. Any further questions? I wanted to know why you didn't mention WhatsApp. It was very important, but is it very green still? In upgrade 6, we would we will release the support with WhatsApp. It's already in the beta. But now we had just half an hour to show you something theoretically. And since we had the lab with WhatsApp during the event, now this lab is not with WhatsApp in order to have a balance. It was in Hodal's keynote, and here it wasn't named. Yes, but you can see it now during the workshop. Seba can show you. In such a short time, we couldn't put all of the information. Sebastian has to upload Rudy. We ask him to have a demo.